Section 3, 1826 to 1879. Chapter 11, Mass Communication for Mass Emancipation. I had a friend, let's call him Mike. He was 6'5" and an easy 300 pounds, football player. I'd watched him truck people on the field, watched him put parents' children on gurneys, all in the name of school pride and athletic victory. I'd watched him grunt and spit and slap himself around like a beast, and we cheered for him. Said his name on the morning announcements, wrote about him in the school paper, even held an in-school press conference when he committed to playing football in college. But many of us cheered for him for other reasons, because he also was a part of the tap dance club, because he played Santa Claus in the winter play, because he took creative writing classes with me to explore his love of poetry, because he spoke out against the mistreatment of young women in our school and stood up for classmates who were being bullied. Mike didn't always get it right, but he was always open to learning and was never afraid to try. The abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison was like that, a man with power and privilege, not afraid to try. Before we get to him, we have to address one of the greatest series of coincidences that led him to become a central figure in the conversation around race and abolitionism. Coincidence number 1. Both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, president number 2 before Jefferson, died on July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Instead of people seeing this double death as a sign that the old ways of doing things were out of style, literally dead, people looked at their deaths as some kind of encouragement to carry out their legacies. It just so happens those legacies were deeply entwined with slavery. Boston had grown to nearly 60,000 people and was fully immersed in New England's Industrial Revolution, which was now running on the wheels of Southern cotton. Coincidence number 2. Though the revolutionary abolitionist movement was practically dead, Robert Finley's American Colonization Society was still functioning at full throttle, trying to get freed slaves to go back to Africa and set up their own colony. The ACS had asked a 23-year-old firebrand named William Lloyd Garrison to give their 4th of July address in 1829. Garrison was the man. He was smart and forward-thinking and worked as an editor of a Quaker-run abolitionist newspaper. But the ACS didn't know that Garrison had gone even further to the side of abolitionism, not colonization. He favored a gradual abolition, a freedom in steps, but abolition nonetheless. And that's what he spoke about at the ACS conference, which, let's just say, was a little off-brand. Like someone speaking at a Nike conference suggesting that the future of better running wasn't better sneakers, but better feet. And Nike should figure out how to make better feet. Garrison wasn't the only man who felt this way about abolishing slavery, not sneakers, and was unafraid to speak out against colonization. David Walker was another. Walker was a black man, and he had written a pamphlet, an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, arguing against the idea that black people were made to serve white people. Walker's appeal spread, and Garrison read it, and eventually the two men met. But before they could really start making a mess of slavery, Walker, just 33 years old, died of tuberculosis. Garrison was influenced greatly by Walker's ideas and carried them on, spreading them by doing what everyone else had done before him. Literature, writing, language. The only difference was that Garrison's predecessors in propaganda always spread damaging information, at least about black people. They'd always printed poison, narratives about black inferiority and white superiority. But Garrison would buck that trend and start a newspaper, The Liberator. The name alone was a match strike. This paper relaunched the abolitionist movement among white people. In his first editorial piece, Garrison changed perspectives from gradual abolition to immediate abolition, meaning he used to believe that freedom was incremental, a little bit at a time, a slow walk. Now he believed that freedom should be instant. Freedom right now, immediately. Break the chains, period. But, because there's always a but, immediate equality, well, that was a different story, and according to Garrison, should be in steps, gradual. So physical freedom now, but social freedom eventually. This idea of gradual equality was rooted in the same principles of uplift suasion. Blacks were seen as scary, and it was their responsibility to convince white people that they weren't. At least, this is what Garrison believed. But this idea was challenged by a man who disagreed with not only the idea of gradual equality, but also the idea that black people needed white people to save them, or that they, black people, were part of the problem at all. His name was Nat Turner. He was a slave and a preacher, and just as slave owners before the Enlightenment era believed slavery was a holy mission, Turner believed the same was true for freedom, that he was called upon by God to plan and execute a massive crusade, an uprising that would free slaves, and in so doing would leave slave masters, their wives, and even their children slaughtered, all in the name of liberation. And it did. There was a lot of bloodshed across the state of Virginia until Turner finally got caught and hanged. Again, slaveholders got scared, tightened the yoke. Garrison counteracted the intensity of the slave masters with an intensity of his own. He wrote a book that refuted colonizationists and gave birth to a new group called the American Anti-Slavery Society, the AASS, a group of abolitionists. At the annual meeting of the AASS in May 1835, members decided to rely on the new technology of mass printing and an efficient postal service to overwhelm the nation with 20 to 50,000 pamphlets a week. Garrison began flooding the market with a new and improved abolitionist information, social media before social media, and slaveholders had no clue what was coming. 1 million anti-slavery pamphlets distributed by the end of the year. Chapter 12, Uncle Tom. With so much anti-slavery info floating around, People, mainly white politicians and scholars who were pro-slavery, turned up the fear and hate, therefore turning up their ridiculous racist ideas. There were people still preaching that slavery was good, that it was the will of God, that equality between the races was impossible because the species were different. Yep, still stuck on the polygenesis theory, but this time it was backed by science. There was a scientist, Samuel Morton, the father of American anthropology, who was measuring the skulls of humans, gross, and determined that white people had bigger skulls and therefore greater intellectual capacity, which, by the way, was how I combated being told all my life that I have a big head. Yeah, because I got a big brain. And I never knew I was a scientist. I also didn't know I was insane. I'm not. But if I were alive and free back then, there's a good chance I would have been labeled as such. The U.S. Census report of 1840 said that free blacks were insane and enslaved blacks were sane, and that the biracial people had shorter lifespans than whites. Of course, this wasn't true. They were cooking the books. And speaking of books, in Samuel Morton's Crania Aegyptica, he also introduced the narrative that historically there was a white Egypt that had black slaves. Who knew? The answer is no one, not even Egyptians. The propaganda just kept coming. Anything to justify supremacy and slavery. And if bunk literature and false studies were the breakbeats of racism, looped samples pulsing on and on, then John C. Calhoun, a senator from South Carolina, was the MC for slavery, an effective one, there to rock the racist crowd. Calhoun was fighting even for Texas to become a slave state in the 1844 election. He was running for office and angry that congressmen were even debating emancipation, possibly ending slavery, and outraged. Calhoun eventually pulled out of the race, and it's a good thing he did because William Lloyd Garrison was about to present a secret weapon to the abolitionist movement. See, it's one thing to talk around slavery, to talk about how the slaves lived and what they were thinking and how good they had it. It's another thing to hear a man who was a slave tell his own story. There was a new special black person on the scene, a new black exhibit, a new Phyllis Wheatley, but this time not in need of a publisher. Garrison would be that. That man's name was Frederick Douglass. In June 1845, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, was published. It outlined Douglass's life and gave a first-hand account of the horrors of slavery. It was a hit and a necessary weapon to once again fight against the idea that black people were subpar and that white people were the benevolent Christians that the likes of Zurah Ride and Cotton Mather worked so hard to portray. It was also meant to gain some kind of white sympathy, but Douglass was a runaway slave with a book about being a runaway slave, which meant he basically snitched on himself and needed to run farther away. So he went to Great Britain and spread his anti-slavery message there, while in America, pro-slavery politicians, now with Texas as a slave state, pushed for even more expansion west. Douglass's narrative wasn't the only one. Is there ever only one? In fact, the telling of his story sparked the telling of many others, including one about an enslaved woman, the narrative of Sojourner Truth. Up until this point, women had been left out of the conversation around slavery, as if they weren't slaves, or as if they weren't slaveholders. Sojourner Truth was a former slave with the moxie of a woman slaveholder, the kind of woman who would stand up in a room full of white people and declare her humanity. She was bold, and that boldness, along with news about the Fugitive Slave Act, which was snatching free blacks and sending them to the cotton fields, inspired a white writer to go on to write a book that would be much, much bigger than Truth's or Douglass's. The book was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The author, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Notes on Uncle Tom's Cabin. 1. Tom, a slave, is sold down the river. 2. He meets a young white girl, Eva. 3. Eva's father buys Tom. 4. Tom and Eva become friends, connecting over Christianity. 5. Eva dies 2 years later, but not before having a vision of heaven. 6. After her death, the white people decide to change their racist ways. 7. Eva's father even promises to free Tom. 8. Eva's father dies before he frees Tom, and Eva's mother sells Tom to a harsher slave owner. 9. This slave owner, Simon Legree, hates Tom for not whipping a fellow slave. 10. Legree tries to break Tom by breaking his faith, but Tom holds tight to Christianity, so Legree has him killed. Moral of the story? We all must be slaves to God. And since docile black people made the best slaves to man, they made the best Christians. And since domineering whites made the worst slaves, they made the worst Christians. So slavery, though a brutal attack on black humanity, was really just proof that white people were bad believers in Jesus. I know. But hey, it didn't have to make too much sense. Despite critiques by intellectual giants like William Lloyd Garrison, who pointed out in The Liberator the religious bigotry in the book and Stowe's endorsement of colonization, and by Frederick Douglass from an assimilationist angle, who followed up by assuring whites that the black man, unlike the native, loves civilization and therefore would never go back to Africa as if Africa were uncivilized, Uncle Tom's Cabin exploded and became the biggest book of its time. Harriet Beecher Stowe became the J.K. Rowling of slave books, and even though black men hated the novel because they were depicted as weak, Stowe's story was drawing more Northerners to the abolitionist movement than the writings and speeches of Garrison and Douglass did in the 1850s. And that was no small feat. Garrison had used The Liberator as a consistent anti-racist sounding board, and Douglass had boldly argued against polygenesis and proved there was no white Egypt, making him the world's most famous black male abolitionist and assimilationist. But women were in support of Stowe. They were ready to fight for their rights and set the nation on fire. Stowe was their gasoline, and her novel was a time bomb that ticked, and after exploding, set the stage for a new political force, especially when it came to the conversation around slavery, Abraham Lincoln.